Hey everyone! Today we're going to explore what life was like inside the walls of a medieval monastery. These were people who chose a completely different path. One focused on serving God, living simply, and escaping the chaos of everyday life. Back in the Middle Ages, people believed that storms, lightning, sickness, and famine weren't just random events. They thought these things happened because God was angry, or evil spirits were up to no good. Life could feel pretty scary and overwhelming. Many folks saw the world as full of sin and suffering, so they wanted out. They figured if they gave up their comforts and lived hard lives of prayer and sacrifice, they'd be closer to God and maybe even save their souls. That's why lots of men, and some women, decided to leave society behind. Some became hermits, living alone in caves or deserts, while others joined groups called monasteries. Now, here's where it gets interesting. At first, monks lived separately, but over time, they started forming communities with strict rules to guide their daily lives. One monk named Benedict came up with a set of guidelines that worked so well, almost every monastery in Western Europe eventually adopted them. His rules covered everything from what monks wore to how they spent their days. Speaking of clothes, can you picture wearing scratchy wool robes all year round? Yeah, not exactly cozy pajamas. Their outfits were usually black, which is why Benedictine monks got the nickname Black Monks. Over the centuries, new groups popped up with slightly different rules and colors, like white monks or gray friars, but most still followed Benedict's blueprint. And don't forget about the women. There were also orders for nuns, led by inspiring figures like Saint Scholastica and Saint Clara. In fact, nunneries became nearly as common as monasteries in certain areas. So, whether you were a man or a woman, there was a place for you if you wanted to dedicate your life to faith. Let me paint a picture of what a typical Benedictine monastery looked like. Imagine a fortress-like compound surrounded by thick walls to keep the outside world, and sometimes robbers, at bay. Inside those walls, the monks had everything they needed to survive without ever stepping foot outside. They grew their own food, baked their own bread, and even made tools and clothes in workshops. Outside the walls there were fields for crops, pastures for animals, and forests for timber. If the land wasn't fertile when they arrived, the monks worked tirelessly to clear swamps and cut down trees until it blossomed into productive farmland. The heart of the monastery was the cloister, a square courtyard surrounded by covered walkways. This is where the monks would stroll quietly, pondering life or chatting softly during breaks. Nearby stood the church, towering above everything else with its spires and statues of saints. Worship was central to their lives, and the monks attended services multiple times a day, even in the middle of the night. Can you imagine waking up at midnight to pray? Yeah, that was normal for them. By sunrise they were back in the church again, singing psalms and reading scripture in Latin. It was intense, but they believed it brought them closer to God. But it wasn't all praying and chanting. Monks kept busy with physical work too. Plowing fields, tending gardens, and crafting goods in workshops filled their days. Saint Benedict himself said idleness was bad for the soul, so staying active was key. And get this, if a monk got too proud of his skills, say, as a carpenter or scribe, he might get reassigned to something humbling, like cleaning stables. Humility was huge. It wasn't enough to feel humble, they had to look and act humble too. Heads bowed, eyes downcast. That was the vibe. One of the coolest things monks did was copy books by hand. Remember, there were no printers back then, so every single book had to be written out letter by letter. Imagine sitting for hours in a quiet room, carefully copying ancient texts. It sounds tedious, but it was actually super important. Monks preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost forever. Works of history, science, philosophy, and religion survived thanks to their dedication. Back then, they didn't have notebooks or printers. Instead, they wrote on parchment, which was made from animal skins. Yeah, you heard that right, animal skins. They'd cut the skins to size, smooth them out with pumice stone, and then carefully mark the margins and draw lines using sharp tools called awls. Their pens weren't fancy either. They used quills from birds or reeds dipped in ink made from soot, gum, and acid. It was messy, time-consuming work, but every letter had to be perfect because these books were precious. And here's something cool. At the start of each chapter, monks would create these big, decorative letters, sometimes even turning them into tiny works of art. These were called illuminated initials, painted in bright colors like gold, blue, and crimson. It took skill and patience, and honestly, it sounds kind of meditative if you think about it. But don't let the beauty fool you, it was hard work. One monk actually wrote at the end of a manuscript, "People who don't know what it's like to write think it's easy. But even though only 3 fingers hold the pen, your whole body gets tired." Another monk named Louis added his own note saying, "Hey, whoever reads this book, please remember me. I copied it while shivering through cold nights and finishing late into the evening because there wasn't enough daylight." These monks weren't just preserving knowledge, they were saving history itself. During the Dark Ages, when chaos ruled and education nearly disappeared, monasteries became the last bastions of learning. Without them, countless ancient texts might have been lost forever. On top of that, monks also kept records of what was happening in the world. While no one else bothered to document events, monks wrote yearly accounts called annals or chronicles. Sure, their histories weren't exactly detailed. Like this one entry from 807 that says, "Duke Grimoald died, lots of monks got sick, and some schoolboys beat up their teacher and ran away. We don't know why those kids acted out. Maybe they were tired of studying when everyone else was off fighting wars and having adventures. Or maybe the sickness scared them. Either way, it gives us a little peek into life back then." Monks also ran schools for boys, teaching them to read and write in Latin, the language of scholars and the church. Again, these schools weren't amazing, but they were better than nothing. Education was all about preparing future priests and monks, not necessarily making well-rounded individuals. Still, without these efforts, literacy might have vanished entirely during those tough times. Now, being a monk came with some serious rules. First, they couldn't own anything, not even personal belongings like books or pens. Everything belonged to the monastery. If someone sent them a gift, it went straight to the abbot, the guy in charge. Second, monks took vows of chastity, meaning they couldn't marry or form romantic relationships. And third, obedience was key. If the abbot told them to do something, even something ridiculous, they had to try their best to follow through. Benedict, the guy who wrote the famous rulebook, said monks should live as simply as possible. No luxuries, no complaints, just plain food, basic clothes, and endless discipline. But here's the thing. Over time, some monasteries grew super rich and powerful. Suddenly, instead of living humbly, monks started enjoying fine foods, fancy robes, and luxurious lifestyles, all paid for by the monastery's wealth. Of course, this went against everything they stood for, so eventually people pushed back. New orders popped up with stricter rules, trying to bring things back to basics. This cycle of strictness, followed by corruption and reform, happened again and again throughout the Middle Ages. If someone wanted to join a monastery, they didn't just walk in and say, "I'm ready." First, they had to prove themselves by becoming a novice, a sort of trial period where they lived under the monastery's rules for a year. If they still felt called to the life after that, they took formal vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Once they made those promises, there was no turning back. As Saint Benedict put it, from that day forward, he cannot leave the monastery or shake off the yoke of the rule. Sure, some monks probably joined for the wrong reasons. Maybe they liked the idea of lounging around in luxury, but many others truly believed this was the best way to serve God. Take, for example, a young nobleman writing about his experience at a French monastery led by Saint Bernard, one of the most respected figures of the 12th century. He describes watching the monks sing holy songs night after night, tirelessly working in gardens, fields, and forests. Some of these men used to be powerful bishops or rulers, yet now they lived as equals, wearing rough, handmade clothes and doing manual labor. To him, it seemed like they weren't ordinary humans anymore. They were closer to angels, living lives hidden with Christ in heaven.